Okay. Awesome. The community outreach spreadsheet. Again, this is a reminder to folks that we have a spreadsheet where we're tracking various folks who are looking at reaching out to various communities. And feel free, if there are communities that occur to you that are new or communities that you would like to represent here, to go ahead and add yourself. I think there's one more I should add here, which is that the Maven folks, Ava and I are reaching out to, trying to arrange a time. It's not clear what time will be arrangeable before the holidays, but we'll try and get something there. It's sort of a subset of the Java ecosystem in some sense. Cool. Anything that folks feel should be added to this spreadsheet, or updates on any of the outreach on the spreadsheet?
So after we engage with the Maven team itself, that should parlay well into speaking with groups like Gradle or other similar as well, because they tend to watch each other as they build out. So I don't think it's something we should do for initial outreach, but I think it's something that if we get a good good impact there, then we should have it on the roadmap to go talk with the others.
Cool. Awesome.
Two things on Maven, one following up on what Frederick said, and something else. Following up on what Frederick said, I know the people at Gradle. So when it's time to reach out to them, let me know, and I will dust off my Rolodex, for the old people in the room who know what that is. Make some calls. And on the Maven thing, if it's logistically possible or logistically simple, I would appreciate attending the Maven meeting. And if it's not logistically simple, no problem. I also have an action item from last week to follow the OpenJDK team so that we can move things along. I'm going to be in London in January, so I'll also try to get together with Martin, because sometimes things over a pint tend to be more accelerative than Zoom meetings.
That can absolutely be true. And I think that the key part of that discussion that may unblock things is drawing a bright line distinction between the class hierarchy, the class dependency hierarchy, and the artifact dependency hierarchy. Because I think the artifact dependency hierarchy for Java is pretty freaking simple, even though the class dependency hierarchy can be complicated.
Yeah, the issue that was everyone was wrapped around the actual of that is import. And it may very well be that we say, look, we're going to totally ignore imports. You know,
yeah, and I think that's actually justifiable from the point of view of artifacts, because all an import statement does is it captures the signature and the return type of whatever it is. It doesn't actually capture any code at all. And so the resulting class file doesn't really bring any code from the class file where you capture the signature and the return type.
That's actually a brilliant framing. And let me say why it's a brilliant framing. Because of Java's runtime linking rather than compile time linking, the general idea is as long as the class signatures are a superset of the class signature that you compiled against, it's okay. That does get into how do we then treat Java as an interpreted language versus a statically built language. So, you know, Rust and Go are super simple because they emit a binary and you know exactly what went into the binary. Because of late linking and even stuff like aspect-oriented programming, there might be some runtime stuff that we also have to capture. Sorry, my other cat was insisting on stuff.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the place where Java gets to be hyper interesting actually is in what do you do with the runtime stuff. It's certainly not the only language that has these characteristics. What's interesting is that it's sort of the exemplar of languages that are explicitly compiled that have this characteristic going on everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So there's an interesting question about how you would handle that. And I think that starts to get interesting where, okay, well, how do you reason about it, right? Because there's a strong tendency to reason about things in terms of class loaders rather than processes in Java, which I remember just enough about that it may be that you've got a class loader, which is basically the head of a tree of the classes that it's loaded. And then you may have the process basically being the head of a tree that is all the class loaders instantiated under that process.
Sorry for interrupting, but this is actually a perfect framing because it reduces the scope of work. So the scope of work for the OpenJDK team is within Java C, put in gitbom generation code, which we can copy from what Bharati did for Clang. Thank you, Bharati. And then we have to also create a modified class loader, but that's the only modification we need to make. We don't need to actually modify the JVM itself. And that's a very powerful statement because, the smaller the blast radius for what needs to be modified, the better.
And actually, now that you mentioned it, you're absolutely right. What I'd forgotten is that class loaders are themselves a tree. So there's a root class loader in the system. And so it's class loaders all the way down.
Just so you know, when you throw in things like OSGI, there may be multiple instantiations of the class loader, but it's the same pattern. I don't think that'll affect us. But one of the things to consider is that it is common for what was compiled versus what is actually ran to often be two separate jars. A really good example of this is the actual Java runtime itself. May be different between your system and mine, but they have a contract that is the same. So if you're running the same version of Java, like that down to the exact runtime, they should be the same. But if I'm running like a 0.7 release and you're running a 0.8 release, there may be differences in that respect. So there has to be a little bit of leeway for something like that. But for things that are loaded from the user, if we were to generate gitbom I guess we would say attestations or receipts through the compiler path, and then we were to verify them on the class loader that say this is the one that was loaded, we could have an auditing mode or an enforcing mode that would allow the operator to tell what is different between what was compiled in the CI/CD versus what is different in the actual runtime, where it was not actually tested explicitly because they're literally two different packages with the same name.
Yep. No, there's a lot of fun stuff there, but I think you're right. If we frame it correctly, we can keep it pretty simple.
Yeah, and to make it a little bit more difficult, if you look at things, log4j is actually a really good example. I might bring in like a log4j-dolop or a log4j -scd out, syslog. Maybe there's an OpenTelemetry version now, so it's also common in the operations where people change out certain classes. So we have to make sure that from a complexity side, there's room to specify certain things as being in an audit mode instead of always enforced.
Yep.
There's one other factor, which is aspect-oriented programming and the other dynamic bytecode generation stuff, which I think is going to be really interesting because if you have AOP modifies the class file in between the time the class loader starts loading it and the time the class loader tells it, here's the bytecode to interpret. And
yeah, but effectively at that point, these tools that are operating on bytecode are effectively just build tools. They're just extraordinarily lately bound build tools. And so, but there's an interesting question of how to handle that, but I think it's going to end up being tractable.
Oh yeah. But I think what it also does is it gives us a lot of concepts to then apply to TypeScript, which is the bytecode for TypeScript is, human readable text that goes through a series of transformations. And I think that the bytecode, which is not human readable text, unless you're really freaky. Sorry, I'm having flashbacks to the 90s.
So you also spent the summer of '95 reading the Java spec.
Dude, I wrote a spreadsheet in Java that dynamically converted formulas into bytecode, injected the bytecode into the JVM so that the formulas were JITted. Sorry. Anyway, so but I think that this actually having these discussions around Java, the JVM, AOP, and other bytecode transformation stuff then greases the skids for the words and the content we'll need for even more dynamic languages like Python or TypeScript or JavaScript, especially JavaScript as it goes through the ECMA, goes from ECMAScript, 2023 back to something that can run in a circa 2000 browser.
Yeah, given the typical proclivity of JavaScript people and their tendency to write a new framework every 3 days, I do expect we'll eventually get to the point where you've got an endless chain of conversions between JavaScript languagelets.
So there is one other possible path that may even that may set us so we may not even have to modify the class loader itself, which is it is possible to load plugins into the Java runtime itself that tie in with the JNI that allow you to do things that are actually at the low level class loader time. And like I used it in the past to trace where part of the problem we have with Java when you use things like YourKit and similar for tracing a system is when you might see like, oh, I have a whole bunch of arrays of integers. Where were those things actually instantiated? Because I have one that's huge, and you'll have no information about the origination of that. And so I was able to instrument the system to actually do to actually pull in trace information and then tag it or track it in a specific way. So there's some areas in the loader and instantiation that can tie in there. And then you pair that up with what's called an agent, which is something that it's like a process that runs when you start the application before you call main, that runs as its own thread. So there's some very interesting interactions that could happen between that and the plugin system that the Java system historically had. I don't know if it's still there, but I assume it is. That may even eliminate the need to modify the class loader itself. Again, I'm not an expert there, but it's something to possibly consider.
Cool. All right, so that was very productive. So really quickly, Barathi, thank you for posting the videos. I know we've been seeing those go out on the Slack channel. And then I think Chris is out this week, so we're not going to talk about other sort of social things unless there's someone who's interested. I know that there was a general discussion of running our own Mastodon server, but I'm not sure that anyone had actually signed up for that yet.
Eva and I had a talk about it. Give me a couple of days.
Perfectly fine. All right, upcoming events. So we'll have to see about Cloud Native SecConf con and see how that goes. Not con in Seattle. There is still a strong suggestion to look at submitting something to the Usenix group of things. So if folks are interested in doing some talks there, that would be fantastic. Chris has pointed us to some broad collections of places to talk at, which I think probably would be a good idea for us to go through at some point, but not, I think, in the context of the meeting. And then Elliot had pointed out global platform SBOM task forces for best practices that are going on, where it may be useful for folks to go and talk. Are there other things that are coming up that we may want to focus the community on event-wise in terms of submitting talks?
No, but this gives me a great idea for a Mastodon plugin for a community Mastodon instance, which is the calendar.
Events calendar, yes.
Yes.
Cool. All right. All right then. So the next item that come up is what to do about holiday meetings. We're coming up against the holidays, and a whole lot of folks are going to be gone for the holidays. Do we want to do something? The question is, do we want to cancel the meetings on the 21st and the 28th of December, and then resume
Yes.
on January 4th?
Definitely.
Okay.
Will we be fully rebranded as Omnivore by the end of this year?
I'm typing as fast as I can.
I've seen you type, which is actually exceedingly fast.
So in the future, we should has an icebreaker. There's a thing called Type Racer, and we should totally use that.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely that's actually probably something I should pull for on the Omnivore update tasks, pull forward into this week's agenda after the POCs is, we've got a bunch of tasks here, website updates, spec updates, Twitter and other social accounts, Mastodon instance, renaming the GitHub orgs, Zoom and Google and GCal and YouTube, and but I think to my mind, getting the website up and going is probably the long pole, because that gives people a branded place to drop. So, but that would be the goal. I would love to get this rebranding behind us, particularly as we go into the new year.
So just a question about other update tasks. Do we have, we've got the IANA Gitoid.
Yes.
Do we have to change that? I'm thinking no, but I'm putting it out there in case there's anybody who has any thoughts on changing it.
I don't think so, no. I think we're perfectly fine to continue to use the IANA Gitoid. In the conversations with the Git community folks, they actually were kind of pleased with that one, because there's a useful way to refer to these things.
And in all fairness, the thing that we're using there is actually a Gitoid. It's not a secondary. It's not a thing built on top of Git. It is literally a Gitoid itself. So I think that there should be no confusion there.
Yep. So do you mind, we're running a little short on time. I'd like to get to POCs before we talk about the SCITT stuff. Does folks mind if we move the SCITT stuff below POCs? Cool. So POCs. Do we have any folks who have new things to show from proof of concept work today?
Not me today.
Okay. I do have a question on the Rust stuff. I'm trying to read the tea leaves a little bit on sort of the what the plan is for the Rust work that's going on. It looks like we're building the Rust library in preparation for using it in the Rust compiler. Am I reading that correct from a tea leaf reading point of view?
That is an eventual thing I'd very much like to do, yes. I talked briefly about it one-on-one. It's not something that's going to happen before the end of the year, obviously.
Oh, yes.
Additionally, Andrew and I have been adding the C API, making it available to languages who can use C bindings. If they don't want to have their own GitBom implementation, they can use the Rust library through the C bindings as well.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. All right then. And then there's that's good to know.
As a follow-up question to Nell, what is, I know that Rust does a new release every 6 weeks.
Correct.
They basically have a beautiful cadence. What is kind of the workflow that gets into a release? In other words, how do they deal with nightlies and, all of the other pre-release stuffs that by the time something isn't stable, it's stable. And what kind of lead time would we have to think about to get Gitoid support into the Rust compiler?
The biggest source of lead time will be submitting it as an RFC, because that can be a very lengthy process. There needs to be discussion on it, community input, etc. People probably on the compiler team would all need to sign off on it. That is a very lengthy process, which does not stop me from doing a proof of concept of adding it to the Rust compiler necessarily. Then it would likely go into unstable for quite some time. The unstable channel, how long something is in there varies a lot depending on what it is, but eventually there will be another RFC to add it to stable. So it would like to get into the official Rust compiler as part of the official Rust releases. It would likely be a lengthy process.
Okay, and just once again, for my knowledge, because I use Rust, but I don't know how it works. Kind of most of my life. Does Rust C contain the linker, or does it do an external call to the LLVM linker?
External call to the LLVM linker. Additionally, if you're compiling on Windows, it uses the Microsoft Visual C++ linker. So the linker is external.
Okay, so we have the POC for the LLVM linker.
Yes.
Would we also have to do a similar POC, and which is, unless we know somebody at Microsoft. Mel, do you know anybody at Microsoft?
Yeah.
Being able to go to the Windows linker team and maybe get a fork of the linker that does the same thing that Bharati has done for the LLVM linker. That might be a piece of the puzzle as well.
It would be, yes. And that also, as far as I know, that linker is not open source. So getting a fork of it building what would be interesting to navigate at the very least. Not impossible, but interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so should we put the Microsoft linker team on our community outreach so that we at least start the conversation with them? Or is that
we can, yes.
Or is that something you think would be better done internally among the Microsofties and without any external, visibility?
Let me get back to you on that one.
Cool. One other question that occurred to me when I was at the LLVM Summit for my own edification on Rust, which is what are the goes-ins and the goes-outs for a Rust compilation, right? So if I compile some set of Rust code to, I presume, like a .o file.
For Linux, yes, it would go into a .o file. There's a few different outputs depending on what kind of library it is, as well as whether it's a binary, what platform you're compiling it for, etc. But yeah, Linux loosely it would be a .o file.
And the goes in, is it a set of files, or like what are the inputs to a .o file? Just taking that simple example.
Right. So a .rs file would be the one end of the spectrum, and then that's lowered into different kinds of intermediate representation by the compiler, and there's different checks run at each of them, and it does eventually get to the output, and then it is linked together by LLVM or MSVC or whatever it is.
So is it a one-to-one correspondence between RS files and output.o files?
I don't think so, because I know you can definitely have multiple RS files going into one .o.
So it's some set of .rs files that go into an .o file.
Correct. Yep.
And for libraries that are, my understanding is all libraries in Rust are distributed as source files, but the compiler creates an intermediate representation of those that contain things like the type structures, etc.
Correct.
So those would go if I have if I'm referencing a library, the compiler will reference one of those intermediate representations. So this is going to be a fun
you're starting to wander. You're wandering into a very interesting space, Dave.
Have you known me not to do that?
Okay, point taken.
It'll be a very thorny experiment when we put it together. Yeah, to say the least.
Yeah, it's going to be a big pile of fun because but I think this also gets into the Java discussion that we were just having, which is figuring out the important transformations between source, the things that humans write, and the thing that is actually rendered as machine code. I think
it may be useful to be a little bit more explicit for everyone in the conversation. I think what you're suggesting, TPP, is that while you can certainly, and it's probably the right first pass, represent source code on a front end, and then just suppress the internal transformations of the intermediate representation and use that on the back end, that there is a whole interesting space for research and exploration around also recording in the artifact dependency graph some aspects of the intermediate representations and their transformations.
Right, but we actually just had that discussion related to the JVM because bytecode is a nice intermediate representation. But we also talked about how the additional transformations might take place by plugins and class loaders and AOP and other stuff like that. I see this as a variation on the same theme. It's just that transformation, the intermediate transformations are stored by the compiler as it compiles library artifacts, and then is assembled during the compile and link phase. So I think, once again, I think there's going to be some very, very interesting work that we collectively have to do to create a roadmap for different languages and different language types to define the important intermediate phases.
So one thing to add into that as well is when we're treading down this path, we're going to ourselves and run into others who will think this doesn't solve the whole space, so let's not do it. But I also want to caution against that, where even if all we did was we got gitbom off from the compiler with the class files or the archives or similar, whatever is actually being loaded by the runtime system. Even if that's all that we got out of that particular space and had no ability to inspect the insides or how it gets transformed by Java, by the class loaders or so on, still provides us with a huge win that shifts the needle for tracking and defending these particular systems. So we should be really careful in the conversations that if people are pushing back because it doesn't solve 100% of all problems, like there's no security system that does, and we need to take into consideration what the status quo is, what is it that we're actually doing today, and what is the difference in value between working today and where we want to go.
Yep. So as much fun as this conversation has been, we have had someone who's actually added a POC they want to show for SHA-256 support for GCC and binutils. And I suspect this was Vyacheslav.
Hi, yes. So, I mean, I don't think a demo really is necessary here because it is the exact same thing that I already multiple times demoed, but just to mention that in addition to what we already had, which was SHA-1, Bharat and I managed to implement SHA-256, to find the appropriate implementation of SHA-256 from core utils GNU-lib library, and we copied it in a libiverty library. So we would also want to just check about the licenses of that code, but it seems to be a GNU lesser GPL, so I think we should be okay there. And then we implemented also the SHA-256 part, so of the gitbom calculation implementation. So now we have two entries in the elf node section, one for SHA-1 gitoid, one for SHA-256. We have two gitbom documents, one for SHA-1 and one for SHA-256. So yes, that is what was done. Also, readelf was updated to support the representation of both
Cool.
entries, both entry types, and that is what we wanted to update the community.
Very cool. So are we to the point where we can use these tools to do things like compile the Linux kernel?
Well, yes, I think so, because all the main things about the implementation are done. Now there are just some new things in the spec that are approved, or maybe
Cool.
testing it a little bit better, because the GCC and binutils testing infrastructure is not really great for our for testing our functionalities. We also talked about maybe creating separate testing testing infrastructure for gitbom, or now omnibor, for all implementations in GCC. binutils also LLVM, Clang, but that is, I guess, still in the talks. We didn't implement anything yet.
Cool. All right. That sounds awesome. No, that's very exciting. Do folks have anything else POC shaped that they want to discuss before we move on to other agenda items? Okay, so someone had added something about SCITT.
So the IETF has a spec for publishing software bills of material. Omnibor is an instance of that, out to the public with, you know, all the appropriate security checks, yada, yada, yada. I'd love to figure out how we can take the output of some of these POCs and start loading them into a POC version of SCITT. So, you know, the Linux, you know, Ed, you asked, can you compile the Linux kernel with it? That'd be a delightful thing to publish, which is, here is effectively all of your Omnibor documents for the Linux kernel. That starts becoming a fun thing to publish, because if you have the Omnibor receipts, you can basically do a correlation in your SIM between, did the receipt that I received correlate to a published version that I should trust? And that, yeah, that becomes a really fun security. And what in this group, we're keeping the focus necessarily and correctly on just the tools for generation. But I think that as we need to have conversations about the true value, being able to, for example, publish the Linux kernel, have a bootloader that publishes the you know, the Omnibor receipt of the Linux kernel to the SIM.
Well, I like this idea that you had of basically doing bogon detection.
Okay.
You know, basically you publish this out to SCITT and then being able to say, does this correspond to an actual published kernel that I should be trusting? And if it doesn't, which of the bogon source files that I'm not seeing here? That I'm seeing here. That becomes quite interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to kind of toss it out, not as a conclusion, but to like get people's heads, yeah, whether it's a bogon detector or anything else, get people's heads starting to wrap around how to communicate the value of what we're building here into the broader security ecosystem. And I'll also pick on Robert, because he and I have had conversations in other forums about, you know, what do we do about SBOMs? So Robert, if you've got any thoughts on how you'd like to see a very granular set of SBOM information published and used, you know, within the stuff that you're doing either internally or in delivery to customers, would love to hear your thoughts.
I was unable to unmute. Sorry, DPP. I just as you mentioned my name, I had lost focus. I didn't catch where you were going with the S-bombs. Sorry.
No worries. So if we think about omnivore/gitboms as incredibly granular representations of the tree that went into building a particular system, the Linux kernel, for example, and we publish that out, how do you see using that from a security perspective in your company? In other words, what kind of things would you look at for both the publishing and consumption of these highly granular SBOMs?
Yeah, it's possible. You would, I would use a consumer tool such as the OWASP tracker. What's it called? Depend tracker. Works really well. If you can load an SBOM into that, what it'll do is go out, reach out and tell you what all your critical vulnerabilities are, or at least the ones that are identified, through the unique identifiers. It would be useful. Maybe less so for something like a Linux kernel, however, where in some respects we kind of know what the problems are with the Linux kernel already, because they do have so many of their own, security. They do a lot of their own security tracking. So I think the programming world sort of accepts the security issues that come with the Linux kernel, with certain exceptions, such as anything that has to do with OpenSSL. Not exactly the kernel, but anything that happens to do every other week there's a problem with OpenSSL.
If only it could be made more boring.
Well, it's got a huge target on its back, right? So the bigger the target, the more problems you're gonna find. I don't know if I answered the question, but
No, it's really helpful, because I think your identification of the OWASP tool is something that we should think, as we're thinking about consumption of omnivore artifacts, what tools out there would we want to integrate with? And I think the OWASP issue tracker is a great one. And if we could basically say, look, we're going to tell you issue tracking, not just at the package level, but also at the known vulnerable file level, that becomes a really interesting use of gitbom/omnivore. So Robert, that was super useful, at least for me.
yeah, thank you. It's early in the morning for me, so doing anything useful is quite amazing.
All right, excellent. So anything else on the SCITT and omnivore stuff? All right, so on the rename stuff, I think we sort of discussed this. I mostly added this here to sort of keep a running track of the things that need to be done. Is there anything else that folks would like to discuss in this meeting? Otherwise, I'm inclined to yield back to balance the time.
Well, let me ask a question that's not on the agenda. Do we want to move the meeting back to something that's more West Coast friendly?
So
That is certainly something I would prefer personally.
Yeah, I'm thinking I might have to FedEx coffee to you now.
I've got some here.
okay, so does someone want to volunteer to open a doodle poll?
I can do that.
Okay. All right then. Anything else? All right, then. I will yield back the time and see you all next week for the last meeting of the year.
Thank you so much, everyone. Good to see you all.
Bye.